Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second live session for Make a Marketing Plan at the Digital Business Academy. My name is Jaideep Prabhu. I'm a professor of marketing here at Cambridge Judge Business School, and I'm joined today in the studio by Richie Mehta. Richie, would you like to say a few words by way of introduction?
Sure, Jaideep, thank you. Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of Making a Marketing Plan. My name is Richie Mehta. I am an entrepreneur that runs a marketing agency called Marketing Lounge CRM. I've been working in the corporate world for about 7 years, predominantly in financial services and insurance. About 8 months ago, I decided to start my first entrepreneurial venture, and that's what I currently do today. Working predominantly with the financial services industry, as well as education institutions.
Great, thanks, Richie.
No worries.
So we have about 50 minutes together this evening. I'd like to start by going over some of the key learning objectives of week 2, and then we'll get into each of the steps of making a marketing plan, and we'll look at some of your comments in the discussion threads. And we'll end the session with a few comments about what you need to do to complete this week and what you can look forward to next week. So in terms of key learning objectives for this week, last week, week 1, we talked about the role of marketing in business. This week, week 2, we really get down to brass tacks and we look at how you go about developing a marketing plan. This is the core of marketing and this course. There are 3 steps to that. You start by segmenting markets or segmentation. You then do targeting, where you identify segments to target, and then you do positioning. You position your offering so that it has a favorable position in the customer's mind relative to competitors. A powerful tool that helps us to do all this together is the Perceptual map. So we'll talk about all these things in greater detail. And I'd like to ask Richie now to guide us through a discussion of these various issues.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Eddie, for that introduction there. Let's start off by talking a little bit about segmentation. Now, segmentation really is one of the most fundamental concepts in marketing. And effectively what it means is all about clustering different customers into groups where they have similar needs, and then being able to perform a certain marketing action based on those sort of similar needs, as it were. So Jaideep, tell me, why do you think it's important to actually segment markets?
Yeah, segmentation is crucial for the following reason. We know that consumers differ in terms of their needs and preferences. And if you want to be most effective at, for instance, acquiring customers, you want to be able to identify what those groups are based on their needs and preferences. And then proceed with how you go about acquiring them. Now, to give you an example of why that's necessary, for instance, consider there are 2 segments in a market. There is the mass market, where people are concerned about basic functions and affordability. And there's the high end of the market where people want sophisticated features and are willing to pay for it. And let's say you come along and say, oh, I'm going to be all things to all people. I'll try and straddle these segments and do something that's in between. You run the risk of having someone steal your lunch from the lower end by offering a product that's specifically for the mass market, as well as someone steal your lunch at the high end by offering a product that's specifically for the high end. So by trying to be all things to all people, you may end up meaning nothing to anyone.
Now, that's actually a really interesting point. And one of the things that you touched on was using segmentation as a way to acquire new type of customers. And what's quite interesting is many organizations today have a core focus on using segmentation for customer acquisition. And actually what is as fundamentally important as well is being able to segment your own customer base, your existing customers, in order to gain incremental value from them. And I think that's one critical area that many entrepreneurs starting their businesses should be thinking about as well. How do they segment their existing customers and understand their needs and wants better, and then be able to service them in a better way and provide value for their existing customer base? It all comes down, sort of some of the key benefits of doing that is you can clearly increase cross-sell to your customers, so you understand them better and you have an ability to sell them additional products based on their needs. You have an ability to upsell products as well. which effectively is sort of premiumization, as it were. And then finally, because of that, because you understand their needs in a much more intricate way, you gain their loyalty, which means that they stay with you for a much longer term, as it were. So I think we've covered why we need to segment markets, as it were. How do you think entrepreneurs should go about segmenting their markets?
So the textbook approaches are fourfold. The most common approach to segmenting markets are using demographics. And these are the best predictors, shall we say, of people's preferences and behavior. Demographics are things like age, income, ethnic background, gender, and so forth. But increasingly, demographics are not enough. You need to use lifestyle or psychographic approaches, people's attitudes, and so on. In the digital world, a third approach is particularly powerful, where you can actually observe people's behavior over time and look at their actual usage to classify them. So for instance, you could look at, let's say you are Amazon, you could look at people who are heavy users versus light users. You could look at a fourth way, which is benefits. What kinds of products are they looking for? And what kinds of features are they interested in? What kinds of books or other kinds of products? So I'd say four: demographics, psychographics, benefits, and usage.
That's really interesting. I think clearly all those techniques are fundamentally important. But for me as an entrepreneur, when I start thinking about how am I going to gain value from my customers, the first lens or the starting point for me is to actually understand where the value in my customer base actually is. So let's take a look at a couple of slides that we have on using value-based segmentation as the starting point, which then leads into some of the more demographic and psychographic techniques that Jaydeep just described. So if we look at sort of slide one, this is very typical when you have a large sort of personal customer base, where the first action that you need to take is to form your two axes of value, as it were. So in this example, what we've used on the x-axis is customer tenure, so how long a customer has actually been with you. And then the second on the y-axis is all looking about the number of products or the amount of revenue that is being generated by that particular customer. And what I would suggest in this instance is to be able to segment your different customers across these three type of different value pools. So in the first instance, where you have customers which have a relatively low tenure within the organization and a low number of products that you may have or have with you. So for example, in the insurance context, it may simply be that they just have they've been with you, they're a year one customer, and effectively they have one product, say motor insurance, for example. Now, you can imagine at that instance that these customers have a lot of potential value, but actually they're not giving you a lot of profit for the business in the first instance. Now, if you take the mid-level value pool, as it were, you effectively have customers that sit within the mid-range or the mid-tenure, which effectively could be someone between a year two and a year 3 and 4 customer, which may have both their motor and home insurance with you. Now, these type of customers are likely to be more valuable from a profitability perspective over the long term. And then finally, you'll have a whole host of customers that actually are very valuable today and are delivering you a lot of profit and benefit currently today in among your base. And effectively what they could be is they could have a sort of a tenure of say 3 or 4 years plus, and perhaps a number of different products that they hold with you. Now, once you've been able to identify your different customers into these different value pools, you then want to go on to develop different strategies to be able to gain incremental value from these customers. So if we think about the next slide that we've got, what we would then suggest is for customers that have a low tenure and a low multi-product holding or revenue, potentially the name of the game could be all about cross-sell, for example. By that, what you're doing is there's a real correlation by the number of products that someone holds with you and the amount of time that they're likely to stay with you. So effectively, in the short term, if you can actually increase the number of products that these customers have, the likelihood is they will stay with you for a longer period of time. That's the theory anyway. When you then start moving into the sort of the next stage, as it were, you can define another set of objectives for the mid-tier or the mid-value type of group, which could be cross-sell and upsell. So effectively what you're doing there is you're looking to cross-sell to certain type of customers where you feel there's a need, for example, or you can go for the premiumization strategy where you're trying to upsell their current product portfolio. And then finally, within high value customers, what you could look to do is it's all about loyalty and retention. So these people deliver you your current value today. The likelihood is they've got or maximized the number of product holdings that they can have with your organization. And what you're trying to do most effectively is hold on to that customer base. So by defining different segmented objectives for these different customer value pools, you now have a really good, robust strategy to treat different segments of customers. So you need to then move on to the next stage of the cycle, as it were. But then you start to understand, what do these customers actually look like? Once you understand that, so you would do traditional techniques that Jaydeep talked about, things like demographic segmentation or behavioral segmentation or psychographic segmentation, to be able to define and understand the different customers that sit within your various value pools. Now, why would you do that? Well, very simply is you need to understand what different marketing treatments you need to offer to these different customer groups. To be able to do that, you need to understand what the customer in a more in-depth way. And that's where the various tools around demographic and psychographic and life stage segmentation come in very handy. The final step in this jigsaw, as it were, is to then do a little bit of a customer journey map and understand or develop a marketing program where you identify where different customers are in different stages of their journey with your organization, and then do a variety of different treatments for that stage that they're currently at. So for example, if you take the renewal cycle, you may want to do certain different marketing treatments for different customer groups to help them understand the merits and benefits of them to resubscribe with your organization. Now that could be anything from a great communication strategy, or it could actually evolve into some sort of incentivization over and above the core product that you're offering them, for them to be able to want to renew with you above anybody else. The final sort of area that I'll pick up on when we talk about customer journeys is dealing with customers in an in-life type of environment. Now, what we mean by that, and I'll give you the context of insurance, for example. Most insurance companies, I'm sure you may have come across this, is they will talk to you at new business, so when they're trying to acquire you as a customer, and then they'll probably talk to you again at renewal. And largely speaking, they may not talk to you in between. So what insurance companies can do to foster that relationship and engagement with customers throughout the cycle, throughout the customer cycle, is create engagement type of programs where they're showing customers the value of being able to or to stay with them, the expertise that they can bring to you to help you live your life more safely, for example, or advice around staying safer on the road or in your home, for example. So these are a variety of different techniques that you can use to be able to get sort of closer to your customers and to engage your customers to foster cross-sell, upsell, and retention. Great. So Jaydeep, let's move on then. How big should your segments actually be?
Yeah, great question. And really, you have a choice on the entire spectrum, from treating the entire market as one segment, so the mass market, so that's a really big segment, to treating every individual customer as a different segment, so a very small segment. And you think of it as a continuum, and you can choose the best position for you, for your product category, for your company, and the nature of the market on that continuum. There are pros and cons. The advantage of going big, that is going with the mass market, is that you get economies of scale. The advantage of going small is that you can effectively customize to specific preferences of people. And so you might imagine that if you're in a commodity market, you might want to go big, segments will be bigger. If you're going with a high-end luxury product, very niche, then your segments are smaller. Now, increasingly, thanks to technology, particularly in the digital space, it's possible to have your cake and eat it too. You can get the advantages of efficiency, but also the advantage of effectiveness by, for instance, combining, the internet with computer-aided techniques of manufacturing. A classic example of this is Levi's. You key in as a customer your specific measurements for jeans, so there's no cost for them to acquire that information. That just goes into their assembly line, which is a fixed cost, and that same assembly line can produce a pair of jeans for you, for me, and for other people. So mass customization. And you can think of lots of examples in the digital space where you can do that kind of thing. Think about a news website. You can customize the news website to your preferences, and so can everybody else. But as far as the broadcaster is concerned, they're putting in the same effort to produce that content, which you then customize.
Yes, it's a very interesting point around sort of the mass customization, and it's certainly something I'll pick up on from a CRM and marketing communication perspective, which is becoming very sophisticated in today's world with the advent of digital technologies. From my point of view, when I start thinking about the way and the how big the segments should be, particularly from an entrepreneurial perspective, I think it's really important to ensure that you've got something which is not overly complex, because you can get really trapped up in complexity when you're thinking about your various customer groups. So the key takeaway that I would have is always looking at your operational efficiency to begin with. Understand the extent to which your organization can deal with a variety of different segments, as it were, and then based on that, decide how big your segments could potentially be. For me, in organizations in which I've worked in before and previously, we typically have no more than something anywhere between sort of 6 to 10 type of customer profiles and segments that we actually try and work with. And in fact, at the outset of the exercise around segmentation, you probably have over 100 different type of profiles and segments that you do work with at a much broader level. But then actually what you're doing is you're whittling it down to really come up with sort of the 5 or 6 or 7 key customer clusters that you think would add value or you could add value to within the marketplace. So keeping it simple for me is really critical when I think about it from an entrepreneurial perspective, particularly when you don't have a huge amount of resources to draw upon. How many customizations can you make, for example, is another key consideration. Reflecting on my own world around CRM, I think what's really happening quite nicely in today's landscape is we have an ability to understand through the advent of things like click-throughs, for example, or time on a particular website. We can really start to understand customer preferences and behaviors. And the way that you would do that, for example, is you put a set of content out in the marketplace to, say, your customer base. You then have an ability to understand the type of behaviors that are being driven through that content. So the number of click-throughs that you have onto the microsite, the links to the type of products that they're then looking at, etc. You then want to form different behavioral customer clusters based on similar content that different segments are looking at. And then thereafter, you can start to personalize the content that you have to make it more appealing and attractive to different customer groups. It's a concept called sort of next best action, as it were, that we're trying to get through. And this is quite easily done in the age of digital technology. There's really easy ways, and Google Analytics actually has a lot of tracking software and ability for you to be able to understand what different people are clicking on. So that's one of the key tools that I think early stage startups should really be using across their websites, across their email communications, and anything that they're putting out into the marketplace. Would you agree with that, Jaideep?
Yep, that sounds a good set of comments there.
Great.
Yeah.
Cool. So Jaideep, when thinking about sort of the way in which entrepreneurs should be choosing which targets or choosing which segments to actually go after, what's your view on that and how they should select the different type of segments to think about?
Yeah, so once they've segmented markets, then the next step is to choose which segment or segments they want to pursue. So how do you go about evaluating segments is really what targeting is all about. And we talk about the so-called 3 C's framework. So there are 3 considerations that you are weighing up. You start obviously with the consumer considerations. So you think about, how big is this segment? Is it growing? What's the ability of consumers in that segment to pay? What's that willingness to pay? So in a sense, how attractive is it from the consumer side? But you also need to think about how competitors are thinking. So if there is a particular segment that's very attractive from the consumer perspective, then other competitors are also going to target it. So then you've got to evaluate how good are we, is our company relative to those competitors in being able to attract those particular customers in that segment.
Yes.
What are our capabilities, our competencies? What is our brand's reputation, if we already have one? What are our strategic objectives? Is that segment really one that we want to go after in the long run? And so these things have to be weighed up, and you're making there is some evaluation that can be done and some analysis that can be done, but there's also some judgment involved in this process.
Great. It's a really relevant point that you talk about trying to identify which customer targets are most perhaps appealing and profitable for you to go after in this space. And in the experience that I've had, one of the organizations in which I worked, we strongly relied upon what was called a brand portfolio strategy, as it were. And the way that we did that was the initial stage was identifying key customer segments or clusters that we believed we had that would be very attractive in our market space. We then looked at different competitor sets to identify whether that we felt there was a gap in the marketplace that we could exploit. And then on the back of that, we actually were able to perhaps reposition and target our different brands to be able to appeal to those different customer groups. So, for example, this is in the insurance context. We had perhaps a low-cost brand, which very much sat on price comparison websites, for example, and that was potentially aimed at the younger customer audiences, say young drivers, for example, and we had different distribution strategies to be able to do that. We had another brand, which then had an ability to target the elderly type of population, for example. And then finally, we had a core brand, which then targeted the mid-mass affluent type of segment. And by being able to position the different brands to appeal to different customer audiences, we could then tap into sort of different profitable segments that sat within the whole marketplace. So we could actually capture a much wider scale of the marketplace than previously. And what's really interesting is, as sort of a final point to this, is all around how you can actually gain access to different customer segments when potentially your organization doesn't have the current capability to go after them. And one of the key techniques that you can use is around partnership marketing. So in the instance of the insurance company, they had the insurance company didn't actually have a whole load of physical infrastructure. And what they actually did do was they actually went out and formed key partnerships with, say, retailers, giving them access to that physical distribution and an enhanced level of customers that type of partner brand would appeal to. So suddenly you're tapping into a whole new type of customer base by forming key partnerships, overcoming some of the obstacles of your infrastructure constraints that you have currently. And certainly from an entrepreneurial perspective, partnerships form an absolute critical point and part of that journey to be able to reach out to much more or wider customers, as it were.
Ruchi, I just want to also say that we'd very much like those who've joined us this evening to send in their comments or questions. I think the best way to do that is through Twitter. So if you have a Twitter account, you can tweet your questions in. Please be sure to include hashtag DBA Live. So please do send in your questions or comments. We will also be commenting on your questions or comments already in the various fora of week 2.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Jaideep. Let's have a look at Pilgrim's moment of truth. where Pilgrim has gone on this journey to create the new smartphone, smart home technology. And he had an absolute dilemma around whether he was going to go after or target a B2B marketplace or a B2C marketplace. So let's watch the video and let's hear from Pilgrim about his dilemma.
In 2006, Adrian Critchlow and I started AlertMe. And our vision was that because of the rise of broadband and because of the rise of connected phones, what became smartphones, it was inevitable that services would arrive that made it possible for people to see what was going on in their homes and to manage their homes using their phones. And that would be a huge market segment. It didn't exist at all in 2006. So we set about building the technical platform which made that possible. And we then had the challenge of how we sold it to people. And we realized that there were two basic ways we could sell it. We could either sell it direct to end consumers, B2C, or we could try and sell through channel partners like telcos, utilities, and retailers. And we could see pros and cons for each. The pros of the B2C side is that we could just start selling to them. We didn't have to ask anyone's permission. The pros of the channel partner side was that they already had extremely large customer bases and they understood them very well, and that we might be able to get to scale very quickly. We weren't entirely sure what the downsides were, but I think in general terms, they would be that selling a new proposition direct to end consumers who may never have heard of it can be quite tough, because before you can actually sell them something, you've got to explain what on earth it is. I mean, that same problem exists even selling through channel partners. The difference is that they can throw more advertising at it. They've got the money to stick at it for longer and create the market. And they may also be able to bundle it with other propositions that they have, so it becomes an adjacent proposition to their existing core proposition. So that was a really interesting dilemma for us as to which way we should go.
So Jaideep, I think Pilgrim's challenge was one that many entrepreneurs face, where effectively they have a product ready to launch. And one of the classic dilemmas are whether you want to go out to a B2B audience or whether you want to go straight to your consumers. What would you say is some of the challenges, and what would you do in that situation?
So it's really a dilemma. I mean, it's one that, as you said, entrepreneurs particularly come up against all the time. Even other companies do, but I think it's a particular dilemma when you have a new product or service and you're entering the market for the first time. As Pilgrim tells us very nicely in his moment of truth for their smart home thing, there really were benefits of going B2B. These were big utility companies that understood their customers, that had brands, had the resources to really reach customers and convince them or persuade them to adopt the service. But the downside potentially of that is that you lose control. And the upside, therefore, of going B2C is that you have much more control over how you will market. And importantly, you have much more direct connection with the customer and can potentially learn faster. Yes. You have a feedback loop, you're closer to the customer, and partly that comes with the control and being close to them. So it's a real dilemma. And if you had to push me against the wall and really force me to make a choice, I think I would be inclined to go B2B if I were an entrepreneur and in Pilgrim's shoes, or in the shoes of some of our entrepreneurs taking this course, simply because it can be very hard, take time and take money to be able to build the momentum that you need to build with customers if you're basically having to bootstrap your business. Whereas if you can piggyback on the capabilities of utilities, then you have a huge advantage potentially over someone who doesn't have that. And you can focus on one or two customers. You just need one good customer, one big utility to adopt your product, and you've already got business. Now, that said, a lot of people wrote in. There's some great comments, and some people made a very good case for B2C. So just, Peter, for instance, made the case for B2C based on get more share of the value add. So that's another downside of going with somebody else, a big player. They have much more power than you, and they're going to extract their pound of flesh.
Yes.
So the question is, do you want to share a potentially much larger pie with a big player, or do you want to keep the entire small pie to yourself?
Absolutely.
And I think one of the sort of judgments you have to make is how big is that big pie going to be if you go with a big player, and how small is that small pie going to be if you go on your own.
Absolutely.
So that's the trade-off. So that's what Peter says. Then Mary also thought B2C was the better option, but she said because customers may not see the pressing need to buy. And I think that's an important point, again, to the argument I was making, is that if they don't see the pressing need to buy, it takes a lot of effort on your part, marketing effort on your part, spend, time, etc. And this is where the muscle of the big B2B player can come in. And there were other thoughts. Barbara had some interesting thoughts about how if you really want to build a brand, you have to go B2C. So that's a good point. If you're in this long term, and you're willing to put in the hard yards, because in the long term, what you want is to really carve out a unique niche for yourself, and you're willing to do the tough work, then obviously you've got to go B2C. And I think there are probably some sectors where going B2C is not such an uphill task. So if you think digital, in many cases, people talk about this sort of adoption curve and, the viral effect or the exponential takeoff that you can see with network effects, Namely, if you can get 10 people and then each of those 10 people can get 10 people, then you get that viral effect going. And so if you can, and essentially what we're saying is that the costs of acquiring customers are low once you've got a critical mass. So, in some digital online contexts, you might be able to do this going it solo. And so I guess it depends to a great extent on the particular industry sector you're in.
Yes. I find that quite interesting, actually, and perhaps reflecting on my own experience of the journey that I've been on over the last 8 months. One of the critical points around my business and why I went B2B was my ability or the resource constraints that I was put under at the outset of the process. I was very conscious that what I wanted to do was be able to generate revenue early on in my business cycle. Because if I didn't do that, it would certainly have certain implications for my own personal financial situation as well. So in a situation where you don't have unlimited resources, you almost need to make the best of what you can. And one of the things that I would say from a B2B play, it could potentially lead to revenue generation earlier on in the cycle than a B2C play. Now, that said, I think there could well be a linear process that takes shape in this space as well. And one of the things that I really do reflect on is a lot of the big manufacturing companies and hardware manufacturing companies in sort of the Far East. Samsung, for example, is a classic one. They actually started out doing B2B, where they would white label their products and obviously let other organizations put their branding on it. Now, once they were able to achieve a level of sophistication within their products, it was almost like they were trying and they were learning on somebody else's time. And then that gives them ability, once they've honed in their product and they've become experts in particular areas, it's then much easier for them to be able to build a brand out of it. They'll also, another big advantage of that is they'll probably have a lot of cash flow to be able to take a little bit more risk as well. And I think that's a critical point just around the cash flow and the risk that young entrepreneurs need to be constantly balancing up against. If they're going to sort of launch and have a sustainable business for the long term.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of view. I mean, I'm just wondering where it might be nice at this point to read out some of the comments. There's some great comments. I'm looking at Annabelle's comment, where she has really laid out the case for B2C versus B2B. She says both parts would have yielded positives and negatives. Direct selling to consumers would have allowed for freedom to continue to innovate the product, to listen to the consumer, to grow organically. Meanwhile, it would have also meant that AlertMe, the brand, would have had to be extremely budget conscious and probably would have had to raise a considerable amount of capital to sustain the business while establishing the brand and products. A B2B approach would have taken AlertMe to potential short-term financial gains. It would have relieved the team from having to create marketing strategies for a segmented audience and from having to raise large amounts of capital to sustain the business. Well, it's interesting. It sort of reflects your argument. In today's business environment, choosing the B2B paths might affect the viability of the business long term, since if AlertMe's team was to get to know its different audiences, it might be too time consuming. So that's a very nice set of comments, I thought. Another set was from Jawad. Jawad, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. And he had some comments as well. He talks about B2B to go mass market. I find the development strategy of AlertMe well done. They're interested to deliver to the whole market with their service. They want a mass marketing approach, so they need a lot of resources. As they're starting, clearly they cannot reach such an objective without a partner. So the partner will bring channels of distribution, retail stores, database of customers, help them get a good prototype for the service, help them scale up, financial resources, support to design the company structure. It's a new product, so it needs a huge promotion campaign to be familiar, and so on and so forth. So that's another set of comments. We've got some comments that just come in today, literally, or yesterday. One from David, who's strongly in favor of B2B rather than B2C. He says, I picked up on the video that they built a platform first, then started to think about selling it, which may suggest that their company's strength is in developing technology. Also, there are probably a number of emerging competitors. If they've spotted the opportunity, then I'm sure others will have. And therefore, selling to an existing business that has a strong market presence will give them the best start to growing their business, which I think is an interesting thing. Finally, the business that they could sell to will have already done the market segmentation and have a customer base already established. Therefore, following the 3 C's, I would recommend B2B. That's his analysis. So he's actually tried to apply this 3 C's analysis because the customers, competitors, and the company. And for a startup, he's saying, he'd probably unbalance go B2B, sort of echoing your views.
Well, and yours too, if push came to shove, as you said.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I think we talked a little bit about mass customization, having your cake and eating it too.
Yeah.
And I actually wonder in this instance of whether that would be a possibility. And the one organization that I always come back to is that of Intel.
Yeah.
Because what Intel have done very effectively is been able to market both in a B2B play, but clearly they've been able to do to resonate with customers to the extent of, if you don't have an Intel processor in your PC, you're not likely to buy the PC. So it's fantastic, and the concept comes down to sort of the push and pull of marketing, as it were. Where effectively the pull of marketing that Intel have been able to create is when consumers demand to have your product, although they can't necessarily tangibly see the product, because obviously it's within a larger sort of piece of kit, effectively. And then clearly the push marketing strategy is effectively when you're putting comms into the marketplace to get consumers to raise awareness of your product, and thereafter obviously create a demand for it. So the push and pull concept of marketing, I think, is an interesting one when considering whether to go B2B or B2C as well.
And in fact, Caitlin, sort of her suggestion is mixed methods.
Great.
She thinks, I think he should have, she's talking about Pilgrim, taken a mixed method approach. So both B2C and partnerships were pursued and employed. One method could have gradually been faded out if the other was more successful. This reminds me of a case that I've taught often, which is it's called Golf Logics, and basically it was this device that would help golfers to manage their game, and it's an electronic handheld device. Nowadays you could probably have an app that you could download. So this is in the days before smartphones, and really they had the same kind of dilemma: should we sell this device to golf courses, so that would be B2B, or should we sell it in the mass market to golfers in retail stores? They went initially with the B2B market simply because it was an easier market to navigate. They knew who their customers were, and they could segment golf courses easily between public courses and private courses, and they knew the sort of who to influence in the golf course. Whereas the B2C market was much more complex, although it was potentially far more lucrative.
Exactly.
So, it's a real dilemma.
Yeah. Interesting trade-offs to be had on both sides of that coin.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's move on. and think about one of the classic things that entrepreneurs, starting out entrepreneurs, are always thinking about is, where do you find your first customer from? And actually, interestingly, as part of that discussion, there's been some really interesting comments that have been posted in the forums around where exactly do you get your customers from. Now, for example, Daniel, perhaps in talking about in the context of B2C, is talking about going to meetup groups, which is a really interesting way of trying to get and gain your customers. Ben, for example, used Google AdWords as a way to try and attract new customers to his product proposition. Jenny, what do you think? What do you think are some of the common techniques for entrepreneurs to get their first customer?
Yeah, that's a really crucial one, isn't it? And really, that's when you know you're on your way. You could have a great idea, all the excitement of a product you think is going to, it's the best thing since sliced bread. Until you get that first customer, you really don't know. And it's really exciting to get that first customer, as you well know. Now, in an ideal world, and this is what the theory says, and this is what this particular week is all about, try and find the ideal customer or customers, the ideal segment, right? That's what we're saying. Segment the market, then choose the best segment for you, and then go after them. Now, that's all very well in theory, and I certainly recommend that people try to do that. But often, simply for practical reasons, you might end up starting with somebody you know. They may not be the best possible customer in the marketplace, but you may never be able to find that best possible customer, or at least it may take you a while. You may have to do a whole lot of research to do it. So from a purely practical standpoint, you might just start with somebody you know well.
Yes.
Somebody in your network, somebody in your network's network, and you bootstrap yourself from there.
Great.
So I think some of the comments that people have, I'm just looking now at Caitlin's, how I got my first customer. I recently started work in the marketing department of a technology company, so I was lucky and already had access to the existing contacts. So, you've got to be pragmatic sometimes. You start somewhere, and then you can be more systematic and thorough about it.
Yes, I find that really interesting. And one of the analogies that I thought about at the early on when I first started my business, or when I was thinking about starting my business in the first instance, was people usually talk about entrepreneurship being a leap of faith. And actually, what I'd like to do is reframe that concept and actually think about entrepreneurship as being much more of an evolution of small steps. So what I would say for anyone who's thinking about starting a business, for example, and you're perhaps maybe currently in a job, is actually just start, doing things on the side, trying to understand where the market need and the gap is, while you're currently engaged in your current day job, as it were. And then based on that, you have an ability to almost get your first customer through your wider network. And then once you have your sort of that first contract in hand, that's the time to sort of take the bull by the horns, as it were, and kind of make that jump into sort of using it more full time. But certainly, I think I completely agree that one of the key things is to use your network, to maximize your network. And once you have gained your first customer, well, however small it may be, however small that revenue is at the outset, what you've got to remember, there's a much bigger picture to be had. And growing that relationship over time can be extremely fruitful for you. So starting out with a small contract, as long as you do that well and you perform well, and keep getting feedback and insight from your customers to ensure that you're doing the right things, I've got no doubt that it'll lead to bigger and better things as well.
Yeah, I'm slightly conscious of time. We probably have about 5 minutes left. I want to remind you again to kindly tweet in if you have any comments or questions using hashtag DBA Live. Shall we then look at positioning?
Absolutely. So when thinking about developing a positioning, Jaideep, what do you think are some of the key things that entrepreneurs should be thinking about?
So, you segment the market, you choose the segment that you want to target, and then the final step in the marketing plan is to position your offering for that target segment so that you are the preferred choice relative to competition. That's what positioning is all about. And there is a strategic aspect to it. For instance, you want to be the high-end brand in that market, or you want to be the mass market brand in that market, or somewhere in the middle. But there's an execution aspect as well. So let's say you are going for that high-end image and position. How do you execute on it? Well, we go to our trusty 4Ps product, which includes many things: the service, the packaging, the brand name, all that kind of stuff goes into the product. Then there's price. What price have you set it at? Where is it available or place? How do you distribute it? And finally, promotion. How do you persuade and inform people about it? And these 4Ps together need to be integrated, because together they're sending this message of what your positioning is, how you want to be thought of, so that customers will see you as being the preferred option relative to competitors. It's how you differentiate yourself. So positioning is really key and requires a lot of practice and iteration and constant improvement.
Great. So when I think about positioning, I come down to trying to understand and uncover a core consumer insight. I almost feel like developing a core insight forms the anchor for the rest of your positioning, how you use the 4Ps effectively. And one of the best campaigns or examples that I've seen in recent times, in recent years, is that of Unilever's Dove campaign, where they talk about real beauty. Now, their core underlying insight with that campaign was that people were very tired of seeing size zero models all around TV, and it didn't resonate with the consumer. So effectively, what Unilever was able to do was to actually translate and reframe that entire proposition of those size zero type of models into what is real beauty all about. That was their core insight, which they were then able to tailor their 4Ps all around that underlying core insight. So I would say, when thinking about positioning, start with what you believe is the core insight for that proposition, and then take it from there by tailoring your 4Ps.
Thanks, Richie. Well, I guess that brings us to our final part of this week, this live session, which is really perceptual maps and your assignment for this week. Now, the perceptual map, as you know, is a very powerful tool. It's a graphical tool that helps you to think about your entire marketing plan. On this two-dimensional or sometimes three-dimensional space, you can do several things. You can identify where the different segments are in this space. You can then decide where you want to be, given which segment you want to target, and where are competitors relative to you on this space. And so it's a map of the marketplace from the consumer's perspective. So it's a very nice way to summarize your market research and your understanding of the marketplace, and then guide you in the positioning. It helps you to think about, okay, if this is the segment we're targeting and they want these specific attributes because they're in this part of the perceptual map. Let's say for a car perceptual map, the target segment for you is high-end sporty. Then obviously you want to ensure that the product has that feature, the price is appropriate, you're distributing it in the right dealership network, you're promoting it by advertising in the right places, and it has the right kind of content. So perceptual maps are a very powerful tool. And as the sort of assignment for this week, week 2, we would like you to use that concept. If you are an entrepreneur and you have your own product, your own offering, then do the perceptual map for that market. If, on the other hand, you're interested in understanding an existing company well, then do a perceptual map for their market and their product. In the map, you will want to be able to show where the main segments are. You can even, by varying the size of the circle, show the size of the segment. You'll want to identify where the main competitors positioned in this space, which segment you wish to target, and then how will you use the 4Ps to get a preferred position for those target customers relative to competitors. So that's the assignment for you for this week. And that brings us to the end of this live session for week 2. Next week, we will be talking about how you evaluate marketing plans. Once you've come up with a marketing plan, you've segmented it, chosen your target segment and position, then you need to think about evaluating it. How is your plan performing in terms of profitability or market share in order to refine it and improve it going forward. So Thanks from Richie.
Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this week's session. Look forward to seeing your comments on the forums in the coming week and speaking to you about your evaluating your market plans in the following week. Thank you.
And thanks for me. And good luck with your work and with doing the assignment for this week and looking at the material for next week. And we'll see you again next Thursday at 6 p.m. Bye.